Here's a question that will blow your mind. Which son of Noah received the greatest blessing, inherited the most territory, and whose descendants would go on to populate entire continents? If you said Shem or Ham, you'd be wrong. The answer is Japheth, and chances are you've barely heard his story. But here's what's even more incredible. If you trace your ancestry back far enough, there's a strong possibility that you are a descendant of this forgotten biblical patriarch. So why has Japheth's story been overlooked for so long? And what does the Bible actually reveal about his earth-shaking legacy? So before we get into it, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Thank you for joining me today. As always, I'd love to hear from you. Say hello in the comments down below. Let us know where you're watching from and what time it is. It really makes us feel like the global community it is. Get comfortable, sit back, grab a drink, and so without further ado, let's dive in. The third son, Japheth in the shadow of the flood. In the ancient world before the waters rose, there lived a man named Noah. He had 3 sons, Shem, whose name meant fame, Ham, whose name carried the heat of passion, and Japheth, whose very name whispered of expansion, of territory stretching beyond the horizon. The text introduces them in that order, always, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, yet it was the third son who would witness something remarkable. His descendants would spread farther than any could imagine. They would populate coastlands and distant mountains. They would become nations whose names would echo through millennia. But before any of that, there was the ark. Picture the scene inside that massive vessel. Timber beams stretched overhead, disappearing into shadow. Animal sounds filled the air from every direction. The smell of hay mixed with the musk of creatures great and small. Light filtered through gaps in the wooden planks, creating patterns on the floor below. Japheth moved through those narrow passages alongside his brothers. They carried water to the animals. They cleared waste. They ensured every creature survived. Day after day, week after week, the routine continued. Outside, the world they knew vanished beneath the flood. Inside, they preserved what would become the seed of a new beginning. Noah's sons worked together in that confined space. They had no choice. The survival of everything depended on their cooperation. Japheth likely wondered what would come after. Would they simply rebuild what was lost? Would the world look the same? He couldn't have known. The prophecy hadn't been spoken yet. The blessing hadn't been pronounced. At that moment, he was simply a son doing his duty, caring for the animals, supporting his father, waiting for the waters to recede. The ark rocked gently with the movement of the deep. Months passed in that floating sanctuary. The family of 8 lived in close quarters, sharing meals, sharing labor, sharing the weight of being humanity's sole survivors. When the waters finally began to fall, when the peaks of mountains emerged from beneath the surface, when the dove returned with an olive branch, they knew their moment had come. The hatch opened. Fresh air rushed in. Dry land stretched before them. Japheth stepped out onto earth that had been washed clean. The old world was gone. A new one waited to be born. He stood beside his brothers on that mountainside, looking out at empty valleys and barren hills. Somewhere in those lands, his destiny waited. Somewhere beyond the horizon, his children's children would build cities and sail seas and speak languages not yet born. The flood had ended. The preservation was complete. Now came the part no one could predict. The part where 3 brothers would become the fathers of nations, where a single family would scatter across the earth, where Japheth, the third son, would inherit more than anyone imagined. But first, there would be a tent, a moment of shame, a choice that would define generations. A fateful act, witnessing shame and charting a destiny. After the waters receded, Noah became a farmer. He planted a vineyard on the slopes of the new earth. The vines grew, the grapes ripened, he made wine from the fruit of his labor. One evening, Noah drank too much. The wine overcame him. He lay in his tent, unclothed, vulnerable in his intoxication. This moment would change everything for his sons. Ham entered the tent and saw his father in that state. What happened next remains debated by scholars. Some suggest Ham merely looked and told his brothers. Others hint at something more serious, a violation beyond sight. The text preserves a certain ambiguity. What matters is what came after. Ham went outside and told Shem and Japheth what he had seen. The 2 brothers faced a choice. They could enter and look upon their father's shame. They could join Ham in whatever mockery might follow. They could do nothing. They chose differently. Shem and Japheth took a garment between them. They lifted it onto their shoulders. They walked backward into the tent. Step by careful step, they moved in reverse, never turning their faces toward their father. The cloak spread between them, held aloft. When they reached Noah, they let the garment fall, covering his nakedness. Their faces remained turned away the entire time. They saw nothing. They preserved their father's dignity even in his lowest moment. This act of honor would not be forgotten. When Noah woke from his wine, he understood what had happened. He knew what Ham had done. He knew how Shem and Japheth had responded. The words that came next were not merely a father's anger. They carried the weight of prophecy. Noah spoke a curse over Canaan, Ham's son. The reasons for this have puzzled readers for generations. Perhaps Canaan had been involved. Perhaps the curse fell on Ham's line rather than Ham himself. Perhaps there were cultural reasons now lost to time. The text doesn't explain, it simply records. Then Noah turned to Shem. He blessed the Lord God of Shem. He declared that Canaan would be Shem's servant. This established Shem's line as the one through which spiritual blessing would flow. From Shem would come Abraham. From Abraham would come the Hebrew people. From them, eventually, would come promises of salvation. Finally, Noah addressed Japheth. These words would echo across continents and centuries. May God enlarge Japheth, and may he dwell in the tents of Shem. Enlarge. The Hebrew word carries multiple meanings. Territorial expansion, certainly. Numerical growth, absolutely. Influence spreading outward like ripples on water. The prophecy suggested something vast, something that would unfold slowly over generations. And the second phrase, dwelling in Shem's tents, opened even more questions. Did it mean conquest? Did it mean harmony? Did it mean learning from Shem's wisdom? Did it speak of physical territory or spiritual inheritance? Japheth stood there, hearing these words. The backward walk with the garment had earned him this blessing. One act of honor had secured the destiny of his descendants. They would expand. They would grow. They would, in some way yet unclear, share in what belonged to Shem. The tent scene ended. Life continued. But something had shifted. Noah's words had set trajectories in motion. Shem would carry the spiritual line. Ham's descendants would serve, and Japheth would expand into territories unknown. The prophecy was spoken. Now history would reveal its meaning over the course of many generations. What Noah pronounced that day wouldn't be fulfilled in his lifetime, or even in Japheth's. The enlargement would take centuries, even millennia, to fully manifest. The prophetic blessing. God enlarge Japheth. The words hung in the air like smoke from a sacrifice. May God enlarge Japheth. Consider that Hebrew word translated as enlarge. Scholars point to its root meaning, to make wide, to open, to give space. It suggests room to grow, freedom to spread, territories opening before advancing feet. The name Japheth itself may come from this same root. His identity and his destiny intertwined from birth. Noah's blessing contained two distinct promises. First, the enlargement. Second, the dwelling in Shem's tents. These phrases have generated centuries of interpretation. Jewish scholars in ancient times saw them as predictions of geographical expansion. Christian commentators later added layers of spiritual meaning. Islamic traditions preserved their own understanding of Japheth's destiny. The enlargement spoke to something observable, something that could be measured in miles and mountains, in cities and populations. Japheth's children would spread farther than Shem's. They would inhabit more diverse landscapes, from frozen northern wastes to Mediterranean shores, from Atlantic coasts to the steppes of Inner Asia. The descendants would scatter like seeds on wind. This expansion wouldn't happen overnight. Generations would pass, tribes would migrate, languages would diverge, families would lose contact with their distant cousins. The original unity would fragment into countless peoples, each with their own customs, their own stories, their own gods, but they would share something, a common ancestor, a link back to that man who walked backward with a cloak, who honored his father in a moment of shame, who received a blessing that would shape continents. The second part of Noah's prophecy proved even more mysterious. He shall dwell in the tents of Shem. Some ancient interpreters believe this spoke of conquest. Japheth's descendants would overrun Shem's territories. They would take the lands, the cities, the wealth. History would bear this out. Greek armies would march through Mesopotamia. Roman legions would occupy Judea. Persian empires would rise and fall in regions originally settled by Shem's children. Other scholars saw something different. Not conquest, but learning. Shem's tents represented wisdom, spiritual knowledge, divine revelation. Japheth would enter those tents not as an enemy, but as a student. He would receive what Shem had to offer. He would benefit from Shem's relationship with the divine. Both interpretations held truth. Both would manifest in different eras. The physical dwelling would come first. Later, much later, a spiritual dwelling would emerge. Gentile nations would embrace the God of the Hebrews. They would claim spiritual ancestry through a Jewish teacher. They would insist they belonged in Shem's tents by adoption, if not by blood. Noah's words created a framework for understanding the future. They didn't determine every detail. Free will still operated. Choices still mattered. Individuals still shaped their own paths. Yet the broad trajectories were established. Shem would carry the covenant line. Japheth would expand and eventually share in Shem's blessing. Ham's line would face servitude, though his story too would contain complexities the brief prophecy couldn't capture. The old man finished speaking. The sons heard their fates pronounced. Life returned to normal routines. Fields needed planting, animals needed tending, families needed feeding, the daily work of survival continued. But something had changed. A trajectory had been set. The words spoken over Japheth that day would unfold across millennia. They would touch peoples he would never know, in lands he could never imagine, speaking languages not yet born. The blessing was given. Now came the long work of living it out. The father of nations, decoding the table of nations. After the flood, after the prophecy, after families began to multiply again, someone recorded the names. The biblical text preserves them in a chapter known as the Table of Nations, 70 names in total. 70 peoples descended from 3 brothers, a symmetry suggesting completeness, wholeness, the full scope of humanity's renewal. The list begins with Japheth. 7 sons sprang from his line: Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, Tiras. 7 names that would become peoples. 7 peoples that would populate vast regions. The number 7 itself carried significance, suggesting completion, divine order. These weren't just random names, each one connected to actual groups known to the ancient world, groups that left archaeological evidence, groups mentioned in other Near Eastern texts, groups whose languages and artifacts allow modern scholars to trace their movements. Gomer's descendants moved north of the Black Sea. Ancient texts from Assyria mention them as the Gimirai. Classical sources knew them as Cimmerians. They appeared in the historical record as fierce warriors, pastoral peoples who swept down from the steppes. Their name lived on in place names, in ethnic memories, in the Crimean Peninsula itself. Magog remained more enigmatic. Some traditions placed them in the distant north. Others associated them with the Scythians, those nomadic horsemen who dominated the Eurasian steppes. The name would later take on apocalyptic significance in Jewish and Christian prophecy, but originally it simply denoted another northern people, fierce and free, living beyond the settled lands. Madai pointed clearly to the Medes. Ancient Persia knew them well. They lived south of the Caspian Sea. They built an empire that would briefly dominate the ancient Near East before merging with the Persians. Their territory became part of the great Persian Empire that would later clash with the Greeks. Javan represented the Greeks themselves. The Hebrew name closely matches the ancient term for Ionians, those Greek speakers who settled the coast of what's now Turkey. From them sprang the classical civilization that would shape Western thought, philosophy, art, and politics. The connection between Javan and the Greeks was never disputed. Some scholars note that Greek mythology preserved traditions of an ancestor named Iapetos, a name that resembles Japheth, though whether this represents a historical connection or coincidence remains debated. Tubal and Meshech appeared together frequently in prophetic texts. Archaeological evidence suggests they inhabited regions south of the Black Sea in ancient Anatolia. Their names survived in Georgian traditions, in Armenian histories, in the complex ethnic tapestry of the Caucasus region. Tiras remains more uncertain. Some scholars connect the name to the Etruscans, that mysterious people who predated Rome and Italy. Others suggest connections to Thracian peoples north of Greece. The archaeological evidence grows murky, the linguistic connections more tentative. Yet the name suggests a people who left their mark. even if modern scholars debate exactly where. Each of these 7 sons had sons of their own. The text records them in detail. Gomer's line included Ashkenaz, later associated with Germanic peoples in Jewish tradition. Javan's sons bore names clearly connected to Mediterranean islands and coastal regions. Elisha linked to Cyprus, Tarshish to distant Spanish shores, or perhaps Sardinia, Kittim to Cyprus again, or Macedon, Rhodanum to Rhodes. The pattern becomes clear. Japheth's descendants spread to the coastlands. They became maritime peoples. They sailed the Mediterranean. They built ships and explored distant shores. The prophecy of enlargement was taking physical form. Territory expanded not just overland, but overseas. Islands became homes. Distant coasts became settlements. This table of nations represents more than genealogy. It captures a worldview. The ancient Hebrews understood their world as populated by related peoples. All humanity shared common ancestry. The divisions into nations came later, after Babel perhaps, after languages multiplied and scattered people groups. The fundamental unity remained underneath the diversity. Modern scholars approach this table from multiple angles. Linguists trace language families. Archaeologists track material cultures. Geneticists examine DNA patterns. The results often support the broad strokes of the biblical account. Indo-European language families did spread from central origins. Mediterranean populations did share cultural connections. The movements of peoples in the ancient world created the ethnic map that would shape all subsequent history. Japheth's 7 sons became 70 nations, became countless more. The expansion Noah prophesied found its expression in population growth, territorial spread, cultural development. The world was filling with people. The empty post-flood earth was becoming crowded again, and a disproportionate share of that growth came from one man's line. The 3rd son, the one who walked backward with a cloak, the one whose name meant enlargement. Japheth was being enlarged indeed. The island peoples, Javan and the seafaring nations. Among Japheth's 7 sons, one stands out for his clear historical legacy. Javan, the Greeks, the people whose ships would carry civilization across the Mediterranean, whose philosophers would shape Western thought, whose language would become the tongue of commerce and culture throughout the ancient world. The connection between Javan and the Greeks requires no scholarly debate. The name itself derives from Ionian, that branch of the Greek people who first colonized the coast of Asia Minor. Later traditions preserved the memory. Greek mythology spoke of Iapetos, the Titan, whose name echoes Japheth. His wife in those myths bore the name Asia, linking the family to the Anatolian Peninsula. Javan had 4 sons recorded in the Table of Nations. Each one represents a distinct maritime culture. Together, they paint a picture of sea peoples, island dwellers, those who looked to the waves rather than the land for their sustenance and expansion. Elisha came first. The ancient sources consistently place this name in Cyprus. That large island off the coast of Syria became a crossroads of Mediterranean trade. Copper mines made it wealthy. Its position made it strategic. Various peoples contested control, but the early inhabitants likely descended from these first settlers. Cyprus would later play roles in Phoenician trade networks, Greek colonial expansion, and eventually Roman administration. Tarshish sparked more debate. The name appears throughout biblical texts as a distant place, the far end of the known world. Ships of Tarshish became proverbial for long-distance trading vessels. Scholars have proposed various locations: southern Spain, perhaps the region of Tartessos that ancient sources mention, or possibly Sardinia, or even distant Britain. What matters is that Tarshish represented the western extreme, the place beyond which lay only ocean, the end of the earth as the ancients knew it. Kittim clearly connected to Cyprus as well, possibly representing a different wave of settlement or a different region of the island. The name evolved in usage. Later Jewish texts used Kittim as a term for various Mediterranean peoples, including Macedonians and Romans. The flexibility suggests a general designation for Western maritime peoples rather than one specific group. Dodanum, sometimes recorded as Rhodanum in variant manuscripts, pointed to Rhodes. That island off the southwest coast of Anatolia became famous for its Colossus, one of the ancient world's 7 wonders. But long before the Great Statue, the island served as a maritime hub. Its position made it perfect for controlling sea routes between Anatolia, the Levant, and Egypt. These four sons of Javan represented something larger than just four tribes. They embodied the maritime expansion that characterized Japheth's inheritance: the coastlands, the islands, the places accessible primarily by ship. The text explicitly states, "From these the coastland peoples spread in their lands, each with their own language, by their clans within their nations." The coastlands, a technical term. It didn't just mean beaches. It meant the regions accessible from the sea, the islands and peninsulas and coastal plains that could be reached by sailing. This represents the fulfillment of Noah's blessing in concrete terms. Enlargement didn't just mean expanding overland. It meant mastering the seas, building ships, developing navigation techniques, establishing colonies on distant shores. The Mediterranean became a Greek lake because Javan's descendants learned to sail it. Greek culture spread through these maritime networks. From the Greek mainland, colonies sprouted on Sicily, southern Italy, the Black Sea coast, North Africa. Wherever ships could reach, Greek speakers followed. They brought their language, their gods, their architectural styles, their philosophical traditions. This expansion created something unprecedented, a network of culturally linked cities stretching across the Mediterranean world. They competed with each other. They traded with each other. They shared a common language, even while developing local variations. The Greek world wasn't a unified empire. It was a cultural sphere held together by ships and shared heritage. The Romans would later build on this foundation. They too descended from Japheth through different lines. They conquered the Mediterranean militarily. They imposed political unity. Yet they adopted Greek culture enthusiastically. Greek remained the language of educated Romans. Greek philosophy shaped Roman thought. Greek art influenced Roman aesthetics. All of this traced back to those four sons of Javan, to those first sailors who ventured beyond sight of land, to the settlers who established colonies on Cyprus and Rhodes, to the traders who sailed to Tarshish and returned with silver and tin, to the maritime peoples who made the Mediterranean a highway rather than a barrier. The prophecy of enlargement took on new meaning in the context of sea power. Territory wasn't just land, it was access. Control of sea routes meant control of trade. Control of islands meant control of strategic positions. The descendants of Japheth inherited not just soil but waves, not just valleys but coastlines, not just one region but a network spanning an entire sea. Javan's legacy endures. Greek language shaped the New Testament. Greek thought influenced Islamic philosophy. Greek political concepts informed modern democracy. From four sons on ancient shores, a civilization emerged that would touch every corner of the future world. The northern tribes, Gomer, Magog, and the steppe peoples. While Javan's descendants mastered the seas, other sons of Japheth turned toward different horizons. They moved north, into colder lands, across steppes and through mountain passes, into territories that would breed different peoples with different ways of life. Gomer led one branch of this northern migration. His three sons established themselves in regions that would echo with their names for centuries: Ashkenaz, Riphath, Togarma. Each name carried forward into history, though tracing the exact paths requires careful comparison of multiple ancient sources, and some identifications remain uncertain. Ashkenaz settled somewhere in the northern reaches. The exact location remains debated among scholars. Medieval Jewish texts later used Ashkenaz to designate Germanic peoples. Modern usage applies it to Jews of Central and Eastern European origin. The name traveled through time, accumulating new meanings while maintaining continuity with that original ancestor. Riphath remains more obscure. Some traditions place his descendants in mountainous regions of Anatolia. Others suggest connections to Carpathian peoples. The archaeological record grows thin, this far from the centers of ancient civilization. The written sources mention these groups only briefly, in passing, when they intersect with the great empires of Mesopotamia or the Mediterranean. Togarma appears more clearly. The name connects to Armenian traditions. Ancient sources place Togarma in eastern Anatolia, in the highlands where Armenian culture would later flourish. The Armenians themselves preserved memories of Togarma as an ancestor. Their chronicles traced royal lineages back through him to Japheth, to Noah. Then there was Magog, that enigmatic name that would take on apocalyptic overtones in later prophecy. Originally, Magog seems to have designated peoples of the far north. Various ancient and medieval sources offer different identifications, though none can be confirmed with certainty. The most common scholarly proposal links Magog with nomadic groups from the steppes, possibly including those later known as Scythians. The Scythians, who may or may not be related to Magog, dominated the Eurasian steppes for centuries. They developed a highly mobile lifestyle based on horses and archery. They buried their chiefs in elaborate kurgans, those burial mounds that still dot the landscape from Ukraine to Kazakhstan. They traded with Greek colonies on the Black Sea. They raided Persian territories. They represented something fundamentally different from the settled agricultural peoples of the South. The Scythians weren't a single ethnic group. They were a collection of related tribes sharing similar lifestyles and technologies. They spoke languages likely related to later Iranian tongues. They worshipped sky gods and practiced shamanic traditions. They left behind spectacular golden artifacts showing intricate animal styles. They mastered mounted warfare centuries before other peoples. Archaeological evidence reveals their spread. Kurgan burials stretch from the Hungarian plain to the borders of China. Scythian influence touched the Celts in the west and the early Chinese in the east. These weren't primitive barbarians. They were sophisticated nomads who chose mobility over settlement, who valued horses and cattle over crops and cities. Other sons of Japheth settled between the seas. Meshech and Tubal lived south of the Black Sea in the highlands of Anatolia. Ancient Assyrian texts mention them. Prophetic books in the Hebrew Bible name them. They existed on the periphery of the great civilizations, sometimes trading, sometimes raiding, maintaining their independence in mountain fastnesses. These northern peoples shared certain characteristics. They lived closer to nature's rhythms. They depended on herding more than farming. They organized into tribes rather than cities. They valued martial prowess and personal honor. They moved with the seasons, following grass for their animals, seeking shelter in valleys during harsh winters. They also shared a potential common ancestor, though most of them forgot. By the time history began recording their deeds, they had diverged into distinct peoples. Languages had split. Customs had evolved. Gods had changed. Modern genetic analysis suggests connections between many of these populations, showing migration patterns that align in general terms with the Table of Nations, though proving specific genealogical links across such vast time spans remains beyond current scientific capabilities. The northern tribes fulfilled the prophecy of enlargement in their own way. They expanded across the steppes. They colonized vast territories. Their descendants would eventually include Slavic peoples, Germanic tribes, Celtic nations. From the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the Arctic to the Mediterranean, the genetic legacy of these northern branches spread. They didn't build the cities that archaeologists love to excavate. They didn't leave extensive written records until much later. They didn't create monumental architecture. Their contribution came differently, through languages that evolved into most of modern Europe's tongues, through genetic lineages that mixed with every settled population they encountered, through cultural elements that persisted even after they adopted sedentary lifestyles, Gomer and Magog, Meshech and Tubal, names from an ancient table, names that once designated real people who made real choices about where to live and how to survive, names that became peoples, peoples that became nations, nations that would shape the world in ways their ancestors couldn't imagine. The historical fulfillment, Japheth and the Indo-European world. The Table of Nations preserves ancient names. Modern scholarship provides the key to understanding them. When linguists in the 18th and 19th centuries began systematically comparing languages, they discovered something remarkable. A vast family of related tongues stretched from Ireland to India. They called it Indo-European. This language family includes most European languages, Greek, Latin, and their descendants, Celtic languages like Irish and Welsh, Germanic languages like English, German, and Swedish, Slavic languages like Russian and Polish, Baltic languages like Lithuanian, also Albanian, also Armenian. It extends east as well, Persian and its relatives, Sanskrit and the languages of northern India, the Tocharian languages once spoken in western China. A massive linguistic net connecting peoples separated by thousands of miles. Linguists can reconstruct elements of the original Proto-Indo-European language, They identify common roots for words like father, mother, brother, sister. They find shared terms for horses and cattle. They notice common words for wheels and axles, suggesting these people knew wagon technology. They observe similarities in verb conjugations and grammatical structures. This points to a common origin. Somewhere, sometime, there existed a population speaking a single language. Their descendants migrated in all directions. Over centuries and millennia, their speech diverged. Pronunciation shifted, vocabulary changed, grammar evolved, yet the fundamental connections remained visible to trained linguistic eyes. The question becomes, who were these original Proto-Indo-European speakers, and where did they live? Various theories compete among scholars. Some place the Proto-Indo-European homeland in the steppes north of the Black Sea. Others suggest Anatolia. Others propose Armenia. The archaeological evidence remains ambiguous. The linguistic evidence narrows the possibilities but doesn't eliminate disagreement. No scholarly consensus has fully emerged on the exact location or time period. What matters for our purposes is the spread pattern. Indo-European languages traveled with migrating populations. Groups moved west into Europe, others pushed south into Anatolia and beyond. Still others headed east toward India and Central Asia. These migrations happened over thousands of years. They weren't organized invasions. They were slow processes of population movement, cultural exchange, and linguistic replacement. The descendants of Japheth, according to the biblical account, populated exactly these regions. His 7 sons and their offspring settled in Anatolia, the Mediterranean coastlands, the areas north of the Black and Caspian Seas. These are precisely the regions from which Indo-European languages spread. Consider the correlations. Javan connects clearly to Greeks, an Indo-European people. Madai links to Medes, whose language belonged to the Indo-European family. Gomer's descendants in the northern steppes may have spoken languages ancestral to later Indo-European tongues, though this remains a scholarly proposal rather than established fact. Tubal and Meshech in Anatolia lived in regions where Indo-European speakers are known to have settled. The fit isn't perfect. The Table of Nations groups peoples by geography and political relationships, not strictly by language. Some groups listed under Japheth may not have spoken Indo-European languages originally. Some Indo-European speakers may descend from lines not explicitly mentioned, yet the broad pattern holds. The peoples called Japhethites in biblical tradition show significant overlap with the Indo-European language family in linguistic classification. This suggests the biblical account preserved real information about population relationships in the ancient world, even if the exact mechanisms and timelines remain subjects of ongoing scholarly debate. These Indo-European peoples would go on to dominate much of world history. The Greeks created philosophical and political traditions that shaped Western civilization. The Romans built an empire that unified the Mediterranean. The Persians constructed one of history's largest empires. The various Europe peoples colonized much of the globe in later centuries. The speakers of Indo-European languages became disproportionately influential in shaping the modern world. This fulfills Noah's prophecy in tangible ways. Japheth was indeed enlarged. His descendants spread farther geographically than Shem's or Ham's. They populated more diverse environments. They developed more varied cultures. From tropical India to Arctic Scandinavia, from Atlantic Ireland to the deserts of Persia, Japheth's children made homes. Their numerical expansion matched their territorial spread. Today, Indo-European language speakers number in the billions. European populations exploded during the Industrial Revolution. Indian populations represent over 1 billion people. Persian speakers number in the millions. The genetic legacy of those original populations, mixed and remixed through countless generations, reaches into most corners of the inhabited world. The enlargement wasn't just physical. It was cultural. Greek thought influenced Roman, which influenced medieval Europe, which shaped the Renaissance, which sparked the Enlightenment, which generated modern science and democracy. Persian poetry and art enriched Islamic civilization. Sanskrit literature preserved ancient wisdom traditions. The cultural contributions of Indo-European peoples shaped human civilization in lasting ways. Noah spoke those words over Japheth long before cities were built, before nations emerged as we understand them. Yet history unfolded in ways that align remarkably with the prophecy. Territory expanded, populations grew, influence spread. Whether one attributes this to divine providence or views it as an ancient text's preservation of migration patterns, the correlation between prophecy and historical outcome remains striking. Dwelling in Shem's tents, the Greco-Roman encounter with Judaism. The prophecy contained two parts. Enlargement came first. Then came something stranger. Japheth would dwell in the tents of Shem. This phrase puzzled interpreters for centuries. Did it mean conquest, harmony, cultural exchange, something else entirely? History would reveal multiple layers of meaning. The first, most literal fulfillment came through military and political domination. The descendants of Japheth repeatedly conquered territories originally settled by descendants of Shem. The Medes and Persians, both Japhethite peoples, built empires that incorporated Mesopotamia, the heartland of Shem. Alexander of Macedon, a Greek, led his armies through the entire Near East. His conquests brought Greek culture to every major city from Egypt to India. Greek became the common language of commerce and administration. Greek philosophy influenced local intellectual traditions. Greek architectural styles appeared in public buildings. The Romans followed. They too were sons of Japheth through the line of Javan. They conquered the Mediterranean world systematically. When they reached Judea, they incorporated it into their empire. They appointed client kings. They collected taxes. They stationed legions. Literally, the descendants of Japheth dwelt in territories that had been Shem's. Yet this political and military dwelling was only part of the story. Something deeper was happening, something that would fulfill the prophecy in unexpected ways. Judaism in the Hellenistic period underwent significant changes. After Alexander's conquests, Jews found themselves living in a Greek-dominated world. They had to engage with Greek culture, Greek language, Greek philosophy. Some resisted, others adapted. Many did both simultaneously. In Alexandria, Egypt's great city, a large Jewish community developed. They spoke Greek primarily. Many couldn't read Hebrew anymore. This created a problem. How could they study their scriptures if they didn't understand the original language? The solution was the Septuagint. Beginning in the 3rd century before the Common Era, Jewish scholars in Alexandria translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek. This massive project took decades. It involved careful linguistic work, theological debate, and cultural negotiation. The result was a Greek version of Jewish scripture accessible to anyone who read Greek. This translation changed everything. Now Gentiles could read Jewish sacred texts. Now God-fearers, those Greeks and Romans attracted to Jewish monotheism, could understand the teachings. Now the wisdom of Shem was available to the children of Japheth. Something remarkable began happening. Gentiles started attending synagogues. They observed Jewish practices. They studied Jewish law. Some converted fully. Many more remained on the margins, accepting Jewish theology while maintaining their Gentile identity. These God-fearers created a bridge population, neither fully Jewish nor fully pagan. Archaeological evidence supports this phenomenon. Synagogue inscriptions mention God-fearers. Ancient authors describe them. The practice became widespread enough that Jewish sources debate how to treat such people. They weren't converts. They weren't bound by all the law, yet they worshiped the God of the Hebrews. This set the stage for an even more dramatic fulfillment. When a Jewish teacher named Jesus began preaching in Galilee, his message initially targeted his own people. When his followers began spreading his teachings after his death, they first went to synagogues. They proclaimed a Jewish Messiah to Jewish audiences. One follower changed the trajectory. Saul of Tarsus, a Hebrew scholar, experienced a dramatic conversion. He became Paul the Apostle. His missionary journeys deliberately targeted Gentile populations. He established communities throughout the Roman Empire. He wrote letters explaining how non-Jews could join this Jewish messianic movement. Paul's theology emphasized that Gentiles didn't need to become Jews first. They could come to the God of the Hebrews directly through faith in the Jewish Messiah. They were, in his metaphor, branches grafted onto the olive tree of the chosen people. They were adopted into the family. They were dwelling in Shem's tents, not as conquerors, but as guests, as adopted children. This spiritual dwelling fulfilled Noah's prophecy in ways far beyond political conquest. The descendants of Japheth embraced the God of Shem. They adopted Jewish scripture as their own. They traced their spiritual lineage through Abraham. They claimed inheritance in promises originally given to Semitic peoples. The spread happened rapidly. Within 3 centuries, this Jewish sect had become the dominant religion of the Roman Empire. The descendants of Japheth were reading Jewish prophets, singing Jewish psalms, celebrating Jewish festivals adapted to new meanings. The tent of Shem had expanded to include multitudes from every nation. The Greek language played a crucial role. The Septuagint had already translated Scripture. The followers of Jesus wrote their accounts in Greek. Paul's letters were in Greek. The language of Japheth carried the message of Shem throughout the inhabited world. Greek philosophy shaped how theologians explained Jewish concepts to Gentile minds. Platonic ideas influenced Christian theology. Aristotelian logic structured theological arguments. Stoic ethics informed moral teachings. The intellectual heritage of Japheth provided tools for understanding the spiritual heritage of Shem. This wasn't replacement. The Jewish people didn't disappear. They maintained their identity, their traditions, their covenant relationship. Rather, Japheth joined them in the tent, shared the space, partook of the blessing. The prophecy never said Japheth would replace Shem. It said he would dwell with him. Later history would complicate this relationship. Tensions would arise. Persecutions would occur. The descendants of Japheth who claimed to dwell in Shem's tents would sometimes turn against their spiritual older brothers. The prophecy described a possibility, not a guarantee of harmony. Yet the fundamental pattern remained. The descendants of Japheth had found their way into Shem's tents. They worshipped Shem's God. They read Shem's scriptures. They claimed Shem's promises. The enlargement had taken spiritual form. The prophecy had found fulfillment beyond geography. The apostle to the Japhethites, Paul, and the turn to the Gentiles. In the 1st century, a man walked the roads of the Roman Empire. His name was Saul, later called Paul. He was a Hebrew of Hebrews, a descendant of Shem through the tribe of Benjamin. He was also a Roman citizen, fluent in Greek, educated in Hellenistic rhetoric. He stood at the intersection of two worlds. His mission would connect them permanently. Paul's letters reveal his strategy. He went first to synagogues in every city. He preached to Jews about their promised Messiah. Some believed, many rejected the message. Then Paul would turn to the Gentiles. This pattern repeated itself throughout his travels. In Pisidian Antioch, he declared that since the Jews rejected the message, he would take it to the Gentiles. In Corinth, when opposition arose from the synagogue, he moved his base of operations next door and focused on Gentile converts. In Rome itself, he told Jewish leaders that the salvation of God had been sent to the Gentiles. Paul understood something profound. The promises made to Abraham included blessing for all nations. The covenant with the Hebrew people was meant to benefit the entire world. The Messiah came from Shem's line, but his work extended to all humanity. This theological insight drove Paul's missionary work. He traveled through territories populated largely by descendants of Japheth, modern Turkey, ancient Galatia, Phrygia, Asia, Greece, and Macedonia, Rome itself. Every major city he visited was culturally Greek or Roman, ethnically Japhethite. His audiences were God-fearers and pagans, people who had never kept Jewish law, people who worshipped at pagan temples, people whose ancestors came from Javan and Gomer and the distant reaches of Japheth's lineage. To them, Paul proclaimed that they could join the people of God without first becoming Jews. Consider his speech in Athens. He stood on the Areopagus, that rocky hill where philosophers gathered to debate ideas. The Parthenon rose behind him, temple to Athena, symbol of Greek culture. Around him sat Epicurean and Stoic philosophers, inheritors of centuries of Greek intellectual tradition. Paul began by acknowledging their religiosity. He noticed their altars, including one to an unknown God. He used this as his entry point. The God you worship in ignorance, he declared, I proclaim to you, the God who made the world and everything in it. He quoted their own poets, Epimenides and Aratus, Greek writers whose words about divine nature Paul appropriated for his message. He spoke their language literally and figuratively. He met them in their own intellectual space. Then he called them to repentance and faith in a Jewish Messiah they had never heard of. Some mocked, others wanted to hear more. A few believed, including Dionysius the Areopagite. The pattern was set. The message of Shem would take root in Japheth's territory, carried by a descendant of Shem who spoke Japheth's languages and understood Japheth's cultures. Paul's letters to his churches reveal the theological framework. In his letter to the Ephesians, he described how Gentiles were once far off but now brought near. The dividing wall of hostility had been broken down. Jews and Gentiles were becoming one new humanity in the Messiah. In his letter to the Romans, he used an agricultural metaphor. The Gentiles were wild olive branches grafted into the cultivated olive tree. They didn't replace the natural branches, they joined them. They drew life from the same root. They partook of the same nourishment. This grafting image captured Noah's prophecy perfectly. Japheth dwelling in Shem's tents, not conquering, not replacing, dwelling together, sharing space, partaking of blessing. Paul faced opposition from multiple directions. Some Jews rejected the idea that Gentiles could join without full conversion. Some Gentile converts wanted to abandon Jewish roots entirely. Paul navigated between these extremes, insisting that the Messiah came from Jewish roots, while his benefits extended to all peoples. His work succeeded beyond what anyone anticipated. Communities of believers sprang up throughout the Mediterranean. They met in homes, they shared meals, they supported each other. They included slaves and free people, Jews and Greeks, men and women. Social barriers crumbled in these gatherings. Within these communities, the descendants of Shem and Japheth literally dwelt together. They broke bread side by side. They prayed in common. They read Hebrew scriptures in Greek translation. They sang psalms and hymns. The tent had expanded to accommodate everyone who would enter. Paul never forgot his heritage. He identified as a Hebrew. He followed Jewish practices when appropriate. He defended the continuing significance of the Jewish people in God's plan. In Romans, he insisted that the gifts and calling of God to the Jewish people were irrevocable. They remained the natural branches of the olive tree. Yet he also championed the inclusion of Gentiles. He fought against those who would require circumcision or full Jewish law observance. He insisted that faith, not ethnic identity or legal compliance, determined membership in God's people. This opened the door for Japheth's descendants to enter Shem's tent on equal footing. The geographical reach of Paul's mission traced Japhethite territory almost exactly. From Jerusalem, he moved through Syria and Asia Minor into Greece and eventually to Rome. These were lands settled by Javan, by the maritime peoples, by those who built cities along the Mediterranean coast. He followed ancient trade routes, spoke in Greek marketplaces, reasoned in Roman colonies. His letters circulated among churches throughout this network. They were copied, shared, read aloud in gatherings. His theological arguments shaped how these communities understood themselves. His practical advice guided their conduct. His vision of Jew and Gentile united in the Messiah became their reality. Paul died in Rome, executed by Roman authorities, yet his work lived on. The churches he planted continued growing. The letters he wrote were preserved and eventually became scripture themselves. The pattern he established, taking a Jewish message to Gentile peoples, continued for centuries. Through Paul's mission, the prophecy found its clearest fulfillment. A descendant of Shem deliberately brought Shem's God to the descendants of Japheth. He invited them into the tent. He explained how they could belong. He defended their right to be there. He celebrated their inclusion while honoring the special role of his own people. Japheth was dwelling in Shem's tents. Not by conquest this time, but by invitation. Not through military might, but through the persuasive power of good news. The enlargement had become spiritual. The inheritance had expanded beyond land to include eternal promises. The third son's blessing was finding fulfillment in ways Noah could never have imagined. The enlarged inheritance, Japheth's legacy in the modern world, stand anywhere in Europe today. Walk through London or Paris, Berlin or Stockholm, Rome or Athens. The streets carry names from Japheth's lineage. The languages spoken trace back to Proto-Indo-European roots. The peoples living there descend in part from those ancient migrations that began after the flood. The same applies across vast stretches of Asia. From Turkey through Iran to India, Indo-European languages dominate. Turkish replaced earlier tongues, but the region's population carries genetic markers linking back to ancient Anatolian peoples descended from Japheth. Persian continues the linguistic line of the Medes. Hindi, Bengali, and other Indian languages all spring from that same Indo-European family tree. Move to the Americas. European colonization brought Japhethite peoples and languages to continents their ancestors never knew. Spanish and Portuguese spread through South America. English dominates North America. French survives in Quebec. These languages carried the genetic and cultural legacy of Japheth across oceans. The modern world reflects the ancient prophecy in concrete ways. The enlargement Noah spoke over his son has manifested in every measurable category. Territory? Indo-European language speakers inhabit more of the Earth's surface than any other language family. Population? Billions of people today descend at least partially from those ancient Japhethite lines. Beyond mere numbers, consider influence. European peoples shaped the modern world through colonization, industrialization, scientific development. Greek philosophy underlies Western thought. Roman law influences modern legal systems. The scientific revolution occurred primarily in Europe. The Industrial Revolution began there. Democratic ideals, however imperfectly applied, emerged from Greco-Roman roots filtered through European history. This isn't a claim of superiority. History is morally complex. The same peoples who gave the world democracy also practiced slavery. Those who advanced science also exploited colonies. The enlargement Noah prophesied said nothing about moral virtue. It spoke of territorial expansion, numerical growth, cultural influence. History confirms all three. The genetic evidence supports the biblical account in broad strokes, though with important qualifications. DNA analysis reveals migration patterns that align with Indo-European language spread in general terms. Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA studies trace population movements from central regions to diverse destinations. These patterns show compatibility with what the Table of Nations describes, though thousands of years of mixing, migration, and population replacement make direct genealogical connections impossible to prove definitively. Languages preserve the connections. Linguists can demonstrate relationships between Sanskrit and Latin, between Greek and Germanic tongues, between Celtic languages and Slavic ones. These aren't surface similarities, they're deep structural connections indicating common origin. The Proto-Indo-European language that scholars reconstruct represents a real ancestral tongue spoken by a real population. That population, according to biblical tradition, descended from Japheth. Modern scholarship identifies them as the source of the Indo-European family. The correlation isn't perfect. The biblical account uses ancient names and groups peoples by different criteria than modern linguistics or genetics, yet the fundamental agreement remains striking. The peoples the Bible calls Japhethites largely correspond to the peoples linguists call Indo-European. The spiritual aspect of the prophecy continues unfolding. The descendants of Japheth embraced the god of Shem through various pathways. Christianity spread through Europe, becoming the dominant religion for centuries. It shaped European culture profoundly. Cathedrals rose in every city. Monasteries preserved learning through dark ages. Universities emerged from church institutions. The entire social fabric incorporated Christian theology and ethics. This wasn't always positive. Christian nations fought religious wars, they persecuted minorities, they justified colonialism with theological arguments. The dwelling in Shem's tents included much that violated the spirit of hospitality the metaphor implied. Yet the connection remained real. European Christians read Hebrew scriptures. They sang Jewish psalms. They traced their spiritual lineage through Abraham. They believed themselves grafted into the promises given to Shem's descendants. They had entered the tent for better and worse. The modern era brings new complexities. Secularization has weakened religious identities across much of Europe. Immigration has diversified populations. Globalization has mixed peoples and cultures in unprecedented ways. The old categories blur, yet the legacy persists. The languages people speak carry Indo-European roots. The legal systems derive from Roman precedents. The philosophical assumptions underlying Western culture trace back to Greek thinkers. The genetic heritage links modern populations to ancient migrations. The religious traditions, even where abandoned, shaped the cultures that emerged. Japheth's enlargement also appears in the global spread of Western cultural forms. Democracy, however imperfectly practiced, has become a global aspiration. Science, developed primarily in European contexts, is now universal. Technology, industrialization, capitalism all bear marks of their origins in Japhethite cultures. The world has been shaped by the expansion Noah prophesied. This raises questions about the future. The prophecy spoke of enlargement, and enlargement occurred. It spoke of dwelling in Shem's tents, and that dwelling happened multiple ways. Does the prophecy continue unfolding, or has it reached its fulfillment? Different traditions answer differently. Some see the prophecy as historically fulfilled, its completion already visible. Others believe it points toward future events, perhaps the full restoration of harmony between descendants of all three brothers. Still others read it purely as historical description without ongoing prophetic significance. What remains undeniable is the historical impact. One man, Japheth, walking backward with a cloak to cover his father's shame. One moment of honor, leading to a blessing. One prophecy, setting trajectories for nations yet unborn. The third son, whose name meant enlargement, who received the promise of expansion, who was told he would dwell in his brother's tent. His descendants filled coastlands and steppes. They built cities and ships. They developed languages that would carry ideas across continents. They created philosophies and legal systems that would shape civilization. They eventually embraced the God of their spiritual older brother, claiming inheritance in promises made to another line. The story of Japheth is the story of expansion, encounter, and inheritance. It begins in a tent after a flood. It continues through centuries of migration and nation building. It finds unexpected fulfillment in spiritual adoption and cultural exchange. It reaches into the present moment, visible in the languages we speak, the ideas we inherit, the complex web of relationships between peoples. Noah's voice speaking that ancient blessing. The words carried power. They shaped history. They revealed something about how the human family would develop after its near extinction. 3 sons, 3 destinies. 3 branches of humanity, each with their role, each with their inheritance, each necessary for the full picture. Japheth was enlarged. His tent was bigger than anyone imagined. And in a twist, the old patriarch probably never foresaw, that enlarged tent became part of a larger dwelling place where all nations could gather, where the blessings promised to one family could extend to every family, where the God of Shem could become the God of all humanity. The forgotten son remembered. The third name in the list revealed as first in territory and numbers, the one who walked backward shown walking forward into a future he couldn't see, but that we now inhabit. Japheth, son of Noah, father of nations, whose legacy surrounds us still.